So we only have one mic. It's a conversation about disclosure, but also connected to accessibility. All your events should have mics, for those who don't know. It makes things more accessible, especially if you're streaming so that people can hear. But welcome, thank you. This is a conversation about disclosure. We have two wonderful people who dedicated their time today from Williams & Connolly. We have Natasha Zek, and we have Macaulay Jones. It's a joke because we went over this earlier and I said it properly. It's Malachi Jones. I was just thinking about messing it up on purpose. I'm sorry. Malachi Jones, and I will let them give short introductions about the work that they do at Williams & Connolly.
Yes, I'm the Chief Diversity Partner at Williams & Connolly, which is a new role for me, but I'm a litigator by trade. I've been at Williams & Connolly for 20-some plus years, doing white-collar criminal defense work and civil litigation, about 50%. And then I also took time, 5 years, to go to the Department of Justice, where I was a civil rights prosecutor. But about 1.5 years ago, the firm came to me and said they wanted somebody to be in a full-time position doing diversity and inclusion work, realizing how important that is for our firm. And so I took on that role. I work on recruiting, retention, and professional advancement for lawyers, and also work on staff inclusion.
Hi, I'm Natasha Zek. I'm the Director of Attorney Recruiting, Diversity, and Development at Williams & Connolly. I actually was a paralegal there in whatever year that was. After clerking and practicing for a number of years, I joined the firm about 10 years ago, and I largely do recruiting, but I took on the mantle of Associate Development and Diversity and Inclusion, mostly in the recruiting space about 4 years ago. So having Malachi expand our D&I efforts has been quite a blessing for the firm. And I do mostly recruiting, but I also do a fair amount of diversity and inclusion work. I also do some attorney counseling at the firm, and these are some sort of near and dear issues, so we're super grateful to be here today.
Thank you so much. So the first question, since we're talking about disclosure, is what does disclosure mean to you in the context of recruiting and hiring, specifically for disability and neurodiverse applicants?
Yeah, I think this question, you have to think about it, because I think it's individual for each situation and each person. It's going to be different. And I think there's a number of factors that need to be considered, or a number of levels where disclosure or non-disclosure can play out. First and foremost, I think it plays out with accommodation, whether you'll be asking or needing an accommodation for the interview process or when you're working. It also plays out at law firms anyway with your performance evaluation, because if you're on the partnership track, performance evaluations obviously plays a big part in that. And so you could have a situation where you don't disclose, but some aspects of your performance get criticized because the lawyers that are evaluating you don't know about your situation. It also plays out in the social context, because in the law firm setting, that's very important for advancement, particularly to partnership. When I was an associate, partners invited me to dinner, they invited me to football games, even lunch, all sorts of social situations which do play into whether you have a chance at becoming a partner. Also, there's another important consideration, which is your own personal satisfaction, and that deals with, can you feel like you bring your authentic self to your workplace and be who you are and not feel like you have to hide something that's an important part of you. And lastly, I think the last consideration is, in the age of the internet and social media, whether you disclose or not, it may come to light somehow, or your people at your law firm or your in the management of the law firm may find out about it. So I think you have to think about all those things when you're thinking about disclosure.
And one thing I will say before we kind of continue the discussion is that we are just two people, right? These are sort of our opinions on the matter, but I do think this is very unique to a particular applicant's level of comfort and the nature of the disability. You know, to your point about the distinction between, you know, sort of what it means. Most firms, this is new to us, and we've made some accommodations for more physical, visible disabilities, but I think for neurodiversity, it's still very sort of a new terrain for us. And so it's a really great opportunity, I think, for students to kind of educate us on what you need so that we can make those accommodations kind of going forward. Because I think for some of the disabilities and accommodations that are presented to us, we're hearing about it for the first time. I think having this conversation with multiple people, recognizing we are just two, I think is important.
That's a great pitch for an event we have coming up, a diversity mixer coming up in April, where we're going to try to have more people in the room. But as a follow-up to that, we were talking about the difference between a visible disability and maybe being neurodiverse or an invisible disability. Are there any types of disclosures or ways that candidates have disclosed to you in the past that you found difficult to navigate, either as an interviewer or just as a firm in general?
I've probably, by my own estimate, interviewed close to 1,000 law students over my career, but honestly, I've never had an issue where, particularly with neurodiversity, where someone disclosed to me, or where I felt there was an issue where someone perhaps didn't disclose to me. So I personally haven't encountered that, but Natasha?
So we actually have what's called a voluntary disclosure form, and it now includes disability as a category of diversity, thanks to Malika actually joining the firm. That's something that we've included. But again, it's voluntary. So as with gender identification or ethnicity, it is something that you are given the opportunity to disclose. And this is when you interview, and then again when you're employed. It's completely voluntary. Because it's relatively new, we've only had probably less than 5 disclosures of disability, kind of outside of the form and collecting the information. And again, most have been physical, I would say. We've not had, not sort of dealt with the issue of a disclosure of another type, but of the more common, it's usually like a visual impairment, wheelchair accessibility, or things of that nature, which the accommodations are for office setup and how to sort of best do the work in the office. But we've not sort of expanded the accommodations because we just certainly haven't dealt with that yet.
I would just add on to that, I think, the key to the disclosure, I think, is the timing of it. Yeah, I guess you just don't want the disclosure to be too late for the firm to be able to make some sort of accommodation if that's necessary for the interview process.
Cool. I guess you were talking about timing, which then the next question kind of goes into is there a preferred method of disclosure that helps you as an interviewer, as a recruiter? So I know a big thing now after a couple of years is that if someone puts that they're a part of Lambda on their resume, it's kind of a soft disclosure. Like they know that you're either an ally of the LGBT community or you're a member of the LGBT community. So is someone doing something like that, or maybe writing about it in their cover letter, does that help, or does that make things easier? Or even like an email when the interview's coming up saying, hey, I have this kind of disability, or I'm this kind of neurodiverse person. How does that help you?
So I find it very helpful in setting up your interview schedule, because we actually customize our schedules based on information on the resume. And that can be for a variety of reasons, right? Because you went to the same law school, you're interested in clerking for this particular judge. But anything that is mentioned in an email, we suggest to us it's important to you. If it's important enough to you to mention to us as a student group that you belong to, or in your cover email, that's something I'm going to try to accommodate when you come in so that it's a better interview for you. And to the extent you need accommodations at the interview stage, I do think people do need those. It's not just an accommodation once you come to the firm. So if it'll help you interview better, whatever that is, that I actually think it is easier to do it in writing. It's kind of a crazy time when interviews come in. We have multiple people coming in. We have teams of people. But having sort of a list of things that we need to keep in mind when a particular applicant's coming in on things that will help them interview at their best, I actually find are very helpful. I do think if you disclose over the phone, it can potentially be awkward, I think, both for people on both ends of the phone. So I think it is probably easier to disclose in writing.
I would just add that it's always nice to have things in writing as a follow-up if someone says that you didn't give them information. The next question is a bit of a shift, but generally there seems to be a stigma about disclosure and self-identification, not just when you're being recruited, but also in law school if you need testing accommodations or classroom accommodations like note-taking or things like that. And there's, obviously it's a cultural thing, so there are various reasons for this, but what would you say to a potential candidate who may have some anxiety about disclosing, who isn't sure if the disclosure will hurt them during the recruitment process or even the hiring process?
I would say that in the working world in general and in the law firms particularly, there's been a lot of change in recent years, particularly with diversity and inclusion. So, just the fact that my role exists and that, I'm in it full time and I also have a coordinator who works with me, now there's 2 people at our law firm who work on inclusion full time, where 18 months ago there wasn't anybody who did that. That in itself signifies a great shift in the legal profession that focuses on inclusion, and it's all types of inclusion. So I would say that people that are worried about the stigma, things are changing. They're not changing all at the same pace. It can depend on the different firms that you're applying to, but as far as facing the stigma, I think it's better to in some instances be upfront about your situation so that you can find out, and judge yourself how the law firm reacts, how the people you're interviewing with react about that, and if they're accommodating and inclusive, then you've learned something, an important piece of information about that place that'll be helpful. Vice versa, if they're not accommodating and not inclusive in their reaction, that also gives you an important piece of information. But I would say in general that people who are concerned about the stigma, inclusion, from the inclusion perspective, are improving a lot at law firms, and law firms are much more welcoming, particularly when hiring. Some of the other issues I deal with are on the other end. It's not just the hiring, but it's giving people a real opportunity to advance and reach the highest level, be it partner or whatever the highest level is.
I would say too, to the extent it's creating too much anxiety such that it's like a block for you, I wouldn't sort of push for it simply because the firm would benefit from having the information, right? I mean, it is just as much about the person's level of comfort in disclosing versus us just thinking the information would be helpful, right? So I sort of lean more towards whatever you're comfortable with, and yes, the firm would love to have the information, and I think it is helpful, but it really has to start with sort of the level of comfort of the person before you kind of move to the next phase.
So this next question is kind of something we talked about in a previous question, but how can we as candidates and you as interviewers and potential employers kind of normalize disclosure so there's not the anxiety that you talked about where it's causing tension in how you're going through the process, and making self-identification easier for candidates who may have disabilities that they want to disclose, and potentially in ways that maybe mirror, again, LGBTQ disclosure, whether it be a pen on lapel or something like that, just a soft kind of disclosure where it's kind of normalized and there isn't this tension and anxiety for candidates.
Yeah, I think in that there's a good to make an analogy to the LGBTQ community because from the time when I was first entering into the legal workforce, there were only 2 openly gay attorneys at our firm, and now I believe there's 10. So things have changed a lot in that respect, and I think the important part of that is not just about disclosure in the recruiting or hiring process. I think it's also important to bring your authentic self to work once you're at a workplace and be open about it. I think for LGBTQ attorneys, that was, not being afraid of engaging in a conversation and mentioning your partner. That meant not being afraid to even bring your partner to a firm social event. It meant being willing to open up about your personal life in your social interactions. So I think the same applies to people with neurodiversity. I think you have to be willing to open yourself up a little bit and be your authentic self when you actually get your job and when you're working, not just for reasons of accommodation, but just for reasons of to make it normal that that's just a normal aspect of diversity. So I think that's an important part of it.
And I think on the firm side, those are things that you as the individual can do. On the firm side, we actually try to educate a lot of our interviewers to talk about diversity, and even if they themselves are not diverse. It's actually very important that everyone be part of the conversation. So, and it is not simply just, some data points and statistics about how many of a particular demographic are at the firm. Our hiring committee members are on every single schedule, and everyone is expected to be well-versed in what we're doing on the Women's Initiative, for diversity inclusion, for staff inclusion, so that if a candidate asks the question, or that the hiring committee member can sort of initiate the conversation. So I think it has to normalize from the firm as well, not just from the candidate who's looking for the job, right? The comfort often should come from the employer, and to have those conversations continue once the person comes, right? So there's that sort of initial phase where we are educated about the initiatives we're doing and talking to candidates, and then when the person sort of arrives, to make sure that that sort of type of inclusion continues, because that's where we find that the drop-off happens, right? Where, okay, I was excited to come, and now how do I feel included once I get here? Why do I want to stay? And so that those conversations have to continue.
Yeah, and also to add in from the firm perspective, obviously I'm a big proponent of inclusion. That's my job. And I think about how can we be more inclusive all the time. And a lot of things I focus on are activities just to get people together outside of the normal workspace to get to know each other better. So we do things like volunteer events where we go and volunteer at a school or painting a house. And families are invited. People bring their children or their significant others. We did a firm hike. So we have different events where I try to get people outside of the workspace and get to know each other and get to know each other's families. So I think that's an important aspect to fostering an inclusive environment.
So we're going to move on to questions that were submitted online, but before we do that, Natasha raised a point, and I just thought of a question. We were talking about educating the entire firm about diversity and inclusion, and Malachi, you mentioned that disability is a part of diversity, which I think is really important. A lot of times on this campus where we have employers and residents and firms coming to present, I like to go up and ask the employees, what is your firm doing to make sure that disability is included in your diversity initiatives? And a lot of time it's just a blank stare, right? They don't know. Their firm either doesn't do it at all or hasn't brought it up to a lower level employee. So how can we change the mindset of the legal community? And I know it's a question that was kind of asked earlier, but making sure that everyone, not just the hiring partners, not just the recruiters, but everyone is understanding that disability is a part of the diversity and inclusion movement, and everyone in the firm needs to be aware of that.
So I will say, because again, this is a relatively new initiative for us in terms of redefining what diversity is, right? I think that historically we think about gender identity, and ethnicity, and that has been broadened to sexual orientation, to first-generation professionals, to military veterans, to disabilities. So I think keeping in mind that it's a constantly evolving process, and including people who are in the quote-unquote majority in that discussion versus just focusing on the diverse individuals. I will say from my perspective, how we've sort of started the conversation came from one of our summer associates who disclosed, and we've hired and is coming. So having someone actually part of our community to sort of start that discussion has been very helpful for us. Because we can try to initiate all we want, but until we sort of have someone sort of on the other end to kind of keep those discussions going, that's actually has been what's most helpful for us, is actually having one of our own hires sort of disclose to us what they need, and then we can sort of respond.
So this question was submitted online previously. What types of disabilities do you think are worth disclosing? Which I think is an extremely personal question, because disclosure by its nature is personal. But and would disclosing major depressive disorder be hurtful to a candidate? Which I think is a pretty direct and poignant question. I would be interested to know the answer as well.
So I do think that this particular disorder, I think, would probably be more helpful to disclose post-offer. I do think there is a difference between disclosures that are made in the interviewing process and post-offer. Simply because if we're being honest about the biases that are on both sides of the table, honestly, I would not want that disability to cloud any other wonderful aspects of a person's resume or personality or presentation. I just don't, but I don't want it to be viewed as don't disclose it at all, right? I do think you want to make sure that people are seeing, like, I'm interested in this firm, the work that you do, I think would be a great fit for your culture. And then once you have made that decision about the culture of the firm being the place you want to be, then that seems to me the time to do it. I will say dealing with depression and even substance abuse tends to be sort of the two biggest challenges for some of our new associates in the counseling that I see. And so I do think it's fairly common, not commonly disclosed, but fairly common. And our firm in particular, I think, has done a really great job in making those accommodations on a one-on-one basis once the employee comes to the firm. But I just don't think it's for broader consumption, something that's this personal, because these are discussed in hiring committee meetings and evaluations and things like that. And I don't know that the individual may appreciate that when they're coming into interview, just sort of how widely comments may be disclosed in the hiring process. And so to the extent you want it to be really individualized disclosure and something that's accommodated for you, to me, that seems like something you might want to do once you've got an offer of employment. But if it affects your ability to interview, that is something you can, I do that on a one-on-one basis. People have asked for accommodations of all sorts, where we try to be discreet, for all sorts of things. It could be a religious observation, it could be a dietary restriction, it could be an accommodation for a physical disability. Most recruiting teams on the front end are pretty good about being discreet to make those accommodations so that you interview at your best.
Yeah, and like I mentioned before, I think you also have to be cognizant of the fact that with the internet and social media, that your employer still may find out about your disability. For me personally, I'm a Naval Academy graduate, but I didn't serve in the Navy because I was medically disqualified. So my resume had the fact that I graduated from the Naval Academy, worked for a year, and then went to law school. So when I was interviewing, that prompted a lot of questions, and I had to be ready to answer that. So I think that's something to consider as well.
Right. And then just the last question, we'll open it up to the audience if they have any questions. How does a candidate transition from disclosing to requesting accommodations? I know we've kind of talked about accommodations throughout. Should they request accommodations during the recruitment process or after being hired? I guess we can extend that question. I don't know who submitted it. But are there different accommodations that they should request for the interviewing process versus working in the actual firm, and how do they differentiate that when they're requesting accommodations?
Yeah, I think Natasha, raised a good point. You want to give your best possible interview. So if it's something that's going to impact your ability to interview, then you should be asking for the accommodation up front prior to the interview, most often dealing with the director of recruiting or whoever on their staff that you're dealing with. But outside of that, in most instances, it's maybe something that you may want to, accommodations you may want to ask for once you have an offer. Once you have an offer, you know, really the power shifts, and you have the power, because in the legal profession, it's a talent industry. In many ways, we're no different than like sports leagues like the NFL or the NBA. There's a limited pool of talent that can perform at the highest level, and once you've been identified as one of those people, we want you, we're competing over you. So in that sense, you know, you have a lot more power, so to say, in that situation once you have that offer from the law firm.
I think too, one thing to keep in mind is most firms are legally required to make accommodations, right? So it's certainly in your interest to do it, right? If you need something for your workspace, whether it's to better telework or some like physical accommodation in your office, firms are happy to do it. But you know, unless you speak up, and actually, it's hard to be the first, right? So that's always the tricky part. But at least at our firm, once we've had one accommodation, then it becomes a policy, and then it can be something that is sort of more widely available to folks who may not have disclosed but are dealing with the same issue. So you actually may be helping your colleagues by asking for those accommodations once you get hired, because it then becomes sort of part of the, you know, sort of the policies and the norm of the firm, if you're willing to be sort of the brave first person to ask.
Thank you so much for your time today. I know I super appreciate it. This is a topic that's very near and dear to me. I wanted to open up questions to the floor if anyone in the audience had questions that they maybe wanted to ask.
We're also available to talk afterwards.
Yeah. That's okay. And just know that the camera is only right here, so I can walk to the mic if you don't want to be seen. Well, thank you so much for coming. Like I said, I really appreciate it. So yeah, round of applause.
Thank you. And the food finally arrived here, so I'm glad, you know, I promised food, so I'm glad I got here. All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming.